I will be talking about the equity perspective of low energy demand futures and decent living standards for all. So, of course, when we talk about um, decent living standards, we know we live in a world that is highly inequitable currently. And here I just illustrate this for a few of the SDGs. So we currently have about 3 billion people who do not have access to clean cooking services. And this brings with it many associated serious impacts, including those for human health, for gender equity, and as well for local air pollution and household air pollution. Several estimates of people without access to electricity also show that about 800 million don't have any connections. But then when we think about reliable electricity, then again, about 3 billion people lack access to reliable electric supply. In addition, we can see that about 2 billion people currently lack access to adequate shelter, which means shelter with a fixed roof and a concrete structure that provides shelter from the weather and provides comfort in the home. And finally, we know over 3.5 billion people also lack adequate sanitation and water supply. So, we are considering decarbonization in a world which remains very inequitable and which will mean that energy demand will have to grow in certain parts of the world in order to meet these services. So I'll start with actually my main messages, the key conclusions that I'd like people to take away from this presentation, which are three here listed. First, trickle-down economics will fail to deliver universal access to decent living standards. So the traditional wisdom has always been, okay, countries will grow, economic growth will bring with it the opportunity for people to really meet their to improve their lifestyles and get access to decent living standards. But we've shown in recent research that this is not going to happen on its own. The second key conclusion is that low energy demand can free development space, and Arnav already alluded to this in his presentation. I will show some recent research that also corroborates this finding. And finally, providing decent living services and standards to all is in fact compatible with the low energy demand future and our climate goals, but it will require focus on redistribution. So the very first point, trickle-down economics is insufficient. So here we've done recent research that really shows that if you look at future scenarios of socioeconomic and population growth, even in very rapidly growing scenarios or scenarios that are optimistic about economic growth and also optimistic about more equitable distribution of income, we find that despite the fact that residential energy use will increase, particularly in regions of the global south, access to basic services that we consider important to a decent living standard will not be met. So in particular, for regions of Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, AFR and SAS in these plots, in these spider plots, and in certain cases in regions of centrally planned Asia or CPA, Latin America, LAM. Some of these services are still not accessible to everyone in 2030. And here, in particular, regions of Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are the ones that are going to probably lack access to such services, even in these very what are considered as sustainable baseline scenarios of socioeconomic and population growth, urbanization, and income distribution. If we zoom in further into how this might vary for certain populations, this is an example only from South Asia. Currently, estimates suggest that over 85% of the population in this region lacks adequate cooling. But what we see in our scenarios as well is the fact that even in 2050, a large share of the population is unlikely to have adequate cooling. And of course, there are inequities even in 2050 in terms of who gets access to cooling and who does not. So here we illustrate differences amongst urban and rural populations for three baseline scenarios, SSP1 being kind of the sustainability scenario, SSP2 a kind of more middle of the road scenario, and SSP3 a less optimistic or a more pessimistic growth scenario. But even in our most optimistic scenario, SSP1, we see that in urban areas, only about 60% of the population may get access to adequate cooling services, whereas in rural areas, less than 20% of the population is likely to be able to afford access to cooling in 2050. So these inequities in access will continue, and trickle-down economics will not ensure that everyone gets adequate access to decent living standards. The second point to be made is that low energy demand can in fact free up development space, as was already mentioned earlier. And here I'd like to present research on yet another study that we did, which looks at residential energy scenarios for sub-Saharan Africa and synergies amongst SDG 7 and SDG 13 goals and targets. So here, two models were compared. Black dots show image model results. Red dots show the message model results. And basically, we looked again at various different scenarios, a baseline, a scenario that achieves universal access to modern energy services, then one which achieves universal access, but also does this more efficiently. So the access efficiency scenario, one that achieves access, but with a large share of renewables, the access renewable scenario, and finally one that does all three of these things synergistically, the access efficiency renewable scenario. And basically the bottom line of this study was that, of course, we do see energy demand growth in all these cases, but in fact, we will see a reduction in the final energy consumption, even up to 25%, if we do universal access with efficiency measures and renewables, for instance. We can also see that there would be a reduction in residential energy related emissions almost by a third if we do these policies together. And finally, we can see investments, lower investments, energy related investments up to 30% if we do this policies together as well. The third result is that decent living standards are compatible, in fact, with low energy demand futures and climate goals. So we mentioned before the inequities in access to decent living standards globally, and recent research within our program has looked at estimating the energy needs for decent living standards, taking a bottom-up approach. Here we see results for by the average needs required by region. And of course, while human needs that we consider are the same, the decent living energy required to meet the needs do vary from region to region because of different technologies in different regions, different needs in terms of weather, heating and cooling requirements, and so on. And we estimate that these needs can vary from 9 to 36 gigajoules per capita per year. So what in fact this shows us in this graph is the fact that in regions of the global north, these existing averages exceed this. In regions of the global south, particularly South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America and Pacific Asia as well, there's still a scope, there's a need to increase energy demand in order to meet decent living standards for all. But in terms of how this compares to future scenarios and the energy demand associated with future scenarios that meet climate goals or a low energy demand future, we see very clearly here from this graph that in fact there is globally enough energy to meet decent living standards for all, and the projections of energy required to meet this decent living for all by 2040 are far below what is projected as energy associated with baseline scenarios or even the low energy demand scenario. But in fact, what is quite a challenge in this case is the fact that in many cases, in some regions in particular, this will require large growth in energy. And in the next graph here, we see how this varies across regions, particularly regions of the global south, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. And here we see that baseline scenarios that are considered sustainable, like sustainability SSP1, are insufficient to meet the needs, energy needs for a decent life for all by 2040 in regions like sub-Saharan Africa. And so what this really shows is that in particular in ambitious climate mitigation scenarios, which are associated with even lower energy demand, this becomes even more problematic because it means these are often projecting reduced final energy per capita growth, which will make it more difficult to achieve decent living standards for all.